Thank you, everyone, for joining our session Beyond the Black-White Binary. I'm Zuri Obi. My pronouns are she, they, and I'm the Film and Conference Programmer here at Noland Film Society. Historically, conversations around Southern identity have centered the Black-white racial binary, but the South is and has been home to a spectrum of communities and cultures that have nuanced what it means to be Southern. Featuring filmmakers whose work have been supported by ITVS, this talk seeks to expand our understanding of Southern identity. It is an honor to introduce our moderator, Noland Walker. It is an honor to introduce our moderator, Noland Walker, who is joined by Naveen, Chaubal, Karla, Murthy, and Tsai. Before I pass the mic, I would like to give a little introduction to each of our speakers. Noland Walker is the content VP at ITVS, where he oversees the organization's funding initiatives, talent, and project cultivation, develops a portfolio of programs, and provides editorial and production support to a broader slate of films. He co-programs the award-winning Independent Lens series and was an Emmy and Peabody Award-winning filmmaker prior to coming to ITVS. His rich, varied career spans public media, network sitcoms, and commercials, as well as independent film. Among the films he's produced, wrote, and directed is Our Citizen King, Jonestown, Life and Death of the People's Temple, and Boogie Man, the Lee Atwater Story. Our speaker, Naveen Chaubal, is a Louisville-based director, producer, and cinematographer. He's a fellow of Project Involve, Fast Track, and Bayback Media Makers, as well as Sundance Institute's Uprise Grant. His work has screened at Tribeca, Hot Docs, and has been supported by ITVS, the Southern Documentary Fund, New Orleans Film Society, as well as Louisville's Visual Art. And Karla Murthy is an Emmy-nominated producer who has been working in news documentaries for over 15 years as a producer, shooter, and correspondent. Her work was described in the Columbia Journalism Review as compelling, informative, and compassionate. Karla's directorial debut, the award-winning feature documentary, The Place That Makes Us, premiered at America Reframe in 2021. And last but not least, Tsai produced and directed KLRU's short documentary series, Austin Revealed, Pioneers from the East, which profiles some of the earliest Chinese American families to settle in Central Texas. His editorial work include Yakona, which won South by Southwest Audience Award, a hybrid film called Pure Cinema about the San Marcos River, distributed on Sundance Now. He also holds an MFA in film and video production from the University of Texas, Austin. Is the former executive director of the Austin Asian American Film Festival and is a Firelight Media documentary alum. His first documentary feature, Sea Drift, premiered at the 2019 Slam Dance Film Festival and was broadcasted on PBS. Thank you to all of these amazing speakers who've joined us today. Just a reminder, the chat box is open for Q&A during the conversation. So if a question pops up, please feel free to drop it in the chat. And without further ado, I'm going to step back and let Noland run the show, and I'll pop back in at the end to help handle the Q&A. So with that, welcome, Noland. Thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, thank you, Zuri. It's a real pleasure and an honor to be here. Really appreciated your conversation with Angela, and really happy to be here with Karla, Naveen, and Tim. Good morning to everyone who's attending, or good afternoon. Hello to our amazing panelists. Welcome to our panel, The Shifting South Beyond the Black and White Binary. As Zuri said, I am Noland Walker, VP of Content for ITVS, and I'm very excited to be the moderator today. Call me biased. I am from the South, Memphis, Tennessee to be exact, and my younger self was shaped by the South of the 70s and 80s. I have long had the opinion that one cannot understand the U.S. if you don't understand the South, the culture, the politics, the history, the hierarchies. Just one unfortunate note, think about it. When Donald Trump won the White House in 2016, people in the South may have been stunned, but very few had to ponder the question of what had happened the way the rest of the nation did. But the South is and always has been about much more. It's space, it's the land, it's religion, it's community. And over the last 40 or 50 years, the South has been slowly moving beyond a Black-white binary as a result of the immigration of people from Vietnam, South Asia, Mexico, and other places in the world where the people are neither Black nor white. How has this begun to reshape the South, complicate the narratives, offer new possibilities? Our guests today have made, or in the process of making, documentary films that explore the realities and in some cases the dream lives of people who have found themselves in the South, having arrived from Iraq, Vietnam, and India, respectively. Tim Tsai is the producer of Seadrift, producer-director. Tim, please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your film.
Hey everyone, thank you so much, Noland and Zuri, for that warm introduction. I'm Tim Tsai. I use he, him pronouns, and Seadrift is my first feature documentary, and it's about the Vietnamese refugee experience in Texas. Specifically, there was a shooting incident in a small town called Seadrift that led to racial hostilities across the U.S. Gulf Coast against Vietnamese fishermen, involving the KKK trying to drive them out. So that was my project. I'm Taiwanese American myself, and was based in Texas for about 12 years. I'm now back in California. So my perspective is really from somebody who was there for a period of time. But yeah, I'll pause there and excited to have this conversation.
Karla Murthy is the director, producer of Gas Station Attendant. Good morning, Karla. Please tell us about your film.
Hi, thanks for having me. So my film, The Gas Station Attendant, is a personal essay film. It's my second film that I've done, and it grew out of conversations I recorded with my dad while he worked nights at a gas station near our home in Texas. I grew up right outside of Houston, and he is originally from India, and he, one night just started telling me about growing up there and his time. He was a street kid for a time when he was in India, and so I was like, oh, we should record some of these just as kind of like a father-daughter thing to do while he worked. And so the film is kind of, more generally looking at, the American dream and what does it really mean to make it in this country? And then also, what does it mean for me now as a second generation, and also trying to, raise a family of my own, and kind of looking back at my dad's life and what are the lessons that I've learned from, watching him try and make it here. So, and I'm actually half Filipino and half Indian. So, yeah.
Thank you. And Naveen Chaubal is the director cinematographer of Pinball. Please tell us about Pinball, Naveen. Welcome.
Thanks, Nolan. Thanks for hosting this. Thanks for the, this Film Society for putting this summit on. It's such a good time of the year to look forward to. So I'm working on a film called Pinball. It's my first feature. And it's a story about a 19-year-old Iraqi-American kid named Yusuf, who's coming of age in Louisville, Kentucky, in the shadow of the war that displaced his family from their homeland now 20 years ago. And for me, I'm Indian American. I grew up in Indiana. A very different reason for coming to this country and for being here. But I think there's something to, as you even mentioned, Karla, this idea of what the American dream is for a young person, and especially when you're straddling two different worlds, how does it actually manifest with your friends and your relationships, and especially in a place like Louisville, Kentucky?
Thank you. Karla, your family moved here when you were young, and can you talk a little bit about who they were before they came here, and what were some of the catalytic events that pushed them to Houston?
Sure. So, as I mentioned, my father, is from India, and he ran away from home at a very young age because they were living in, extreme poverty outside of Bangalore. And was traveling all over India. This was in, the late 40s, 50s, getting jobs wherever he could. He was probably around like 10, 11, 12, and then up until he was a teenager, and then eventually was working at a hotel. And one night met a couple who was from Houston. It was a Jewish family, husband and wife, who were traveling around India. And he waited on them for one night and struck up a friendship with them. And they ended up sponsoring him to come to the US, and they became, like parents to him. I used to call them my foster grandparents. So they brought him to Houston. And then my mother, who's from the Philippines, was part of that first wave of nurses who was brought over to the US, and was working at the medical center in Houston. And so they met, one night at an international, party for students. And yeah, so that's what initially brought them here. And and then they traveled around a bit, but then ended up back in Houston, where I grew up.
What was the Houston that you grew up in like? What do you remember about that?
Well, one of the things that I love, like as I was making this film, I looked back into, we have all these old Super 8 films, and I have a Super 8 film of their wedding, from the early 60s of Houston. And it's so amazing to me to see the people, the images of people, because you have, our Filipino relatives with the butterfly sleeves, and the beautiful dresses, and then my dad's friends, who had Sikh friends, and then this Jewish family, and all these people. And it's just a slice of Houston that I don't think a lot of people even know existed, in the 60s. I don't think that's what they would ever think of. And today, Fort Bend County, where I grew up in, which is right outside of Houston, is now, one of the most diverse counties in the country. I think it's like number 3 now. Number 1 is also in the South, which I think is Gwinnett County in Georgia. And that's that's how I grew up, in a very, very diverse community. I'm not saying it was all lovey-dovey, but it was extremely diverse kind of upbringing. And those were my neighbors were Mexican, Black, Indian, all from, a whole range of people.
Naveen, when we talked, you actually mentioned that you grew up in a suburb in outside of Indianapolis, Indiana, which is not technically the South, but it's pretty Southern. So what was that like, and who was your family, and how do you remember your sense of who you were there?
Yeah, it was really interesting, I think, and that's where I see so many ties to the way Yusuf has been growing up, where there happened to be a lot of Indian families coming over and settling in this place. And so my parents were part of this generation that were kind of insular in a way. It stayed close. You're kind of forced to make friends with other Indian families who were there, and other Indian kids. But eventually these kids became the basis of like the relationships I had. And we were navigating our whole lives together, like literally from birth. There was like 5 or 6 families that all lived in the same apartment building for a many number of years. And all our parents raised each other together. So we kind of did so many things together that just made sense to us, and maybe not to other people that we were growing up with and the outside friends that we were growing up with. But at some point, I think a lot of these friendships that felt a little forced started to like break down as we actually realized the individual identities that we had, that it wasn't just about being Indian or being Hindu, right? There was so much more that we wanted to explore. And just even for me personally, like I left. And I feel like that's also where I see these ties to the way Yusuf is feeling. It's like this feeling of needing to leave the cultural kind of like bonds that hold you into this one place, because you're not fitting in and you're not feeling like you can like really expand what your identity is beyond just 1 or 2 things.
Karla, we were talking about identity before in the context of religion, and your family had an interesting kind of shift. Can you talk about that? I was really talking about your dad and Christianity.
Dad. Yeah. Well, my, father was actually Brahmin, and you know, there was he really did not like all the rituals around that, the whole thing. And so when he came to this country, he really just wanted to kind of remake himself, I think. And even though his sponsor, you know, his parents were Jewish, he decided to become Christian. I think it was around the time he met my mother also, who was Christian. And so, you know, sometimes I think it was sort of this assimilationist kind of move, but the way they practiced Christianity, though, that when I grew up, it was a very personal I mean, we prayed every night as a family, and it was a very like quiet, personal kind of way of practicing Christianity. So very different from like a lot of our neighbors who we used to call them like country club Christians, just like a different mode.
Tim, you had a really different experience in making your film. You were coming in from from outside of the community in Texas to make the film. Can you talk about what drew you to that story and what you found when you got there?
Yeah, thanks for that question, Noland. So, you know, earlier, you know, we were talking about kind of religion and sort of sanctuary. One thing, you know, as a Taiwanese American, making a film about this small Vietnamese community in Texas, I come to realize that religion was a big part of how they found safety. The Catholic Church was a big part of resettling and sponsoring different Vietnamese communities in Texas and elsewhere. And then a lot of these communities, you know, for me to come in and get to know the community, a lot of times they default to kind of having me speak to the Catholic priest and to get there, have them sort of get to know me a bit before I'm able to kind of interact with the community. And really, you know, for me to actually get access to the stories I did end up getting access to, it really took the right person to help make that access possible. I had traveled down to the coast with a second generation Vietnamese American filmmaker. He can, you know, translate for me, and people were pretty open to talking to us. But when I wanted to actually sit down and do the interview, they would say, "Oh, I'm busy." They would politely refuse, basically. So it wasn't until I worked through an older gentleman who served in the Vietnamese Air Force. He's actually my advisor and co-producer's father. He's based in Houston, and he ended up connecting with his friends who were in another town on the coast, and connected through him to this, you know, the characters in the film that ended up talking to us. And it was through that connection that we finally opened the doors. And you can tell right away that, you know, for somebody to connect with somebody who went through the war with them, like right away, the welcoming was so different. Like they would just welcome us into their homes and offer us food. So that really was what ended up allowing us to make the film.
And when we talked initially, you said something that was really interesting to me, which was, you said, you know, if you know fishing in Texas or Louisiana, you know the Vietnamese. Tell me what that means and what you meant when you said that, because that's not something that we typically think about when we think about Louisiana shrimpers or people fishing off the Gulf Coast.
Yeah, I mean, the Vietnamese, you know, came to the U.S. and they were kind of immigration tried to kind of split them, you know, spread the refugees across the country in small groups, but eventually they ended up on the Gulf Coast. A lot of stories we heard are just, you know, people who were resettled in the Midwest and had never seen snow before. right? So naturally, there was work available on the coast, and that's where they ended up. And so in these small towns, so for example, in Seadrift, the population was maybe 1,000, about 100 Vietnamese came. So it's sizable for that community. And so if you worked in the seafood industry in Texas, like that migration really impacted your experience. And for many of those communities, that's the first time they've seen a Asian face. And so as I was working on the film, you just come to realize that everyone who was in the industry or is in the industry, like they have really strong feelings about the Vietnamese's entry into that industry.
And this is a question for the room, really. How are stories of South Asian, Iraqi, Asian migration and communities, how is their actual presence changing the Southern imagination? And then how is the story of their presence changing the Southern imagination?
I think it's like it's ongoing. Like we're in the middle of it right now, in the thick of it, trying to figure out what the reimagined South is like. And even for me, like I'm a transplant to Louisville, but I have these conversations with Yusuf and his family too, where they don't know if they want to stay here. It's like, do they want to be a part of that reimagination or not? It's still this ongoing question that needs to be answered in ways. I think they're making it work, and they're trying to figure out what that could be like. But I think there's this idea of escapism that I think is kind of part of it, and this idea of like how stories and fantasy can be incorporated in the way that we live out our lives. And I think, to me, what I relate with Yusuf is like he always talks about these ideas and these dreams, and I think how that is woven into how you navigate your job and your friendships and the conversations that you're having day to day is we're seeing the seeds planted right now.
I think, in Houston, we're starting to see more narratives coming out. Like there's the show Mo, which is about a Palestinian American, but I think it's been there for a while. It's just no one, we just haven't been highlighting those stories. And as, areas like Houston become more diverse, I mean, not to make it political, but it's a threat to a lot of people, this status quo. I mean, just, in Texas, the largest amount of growth in population in the last census was from people of color. Yet, when they redistricted the state, they created more white majority districts. So I think there's also just like a natural resistance, not a natural resistance, but there is a resistance to kind of embrace this new version of the South as well, from a political standpoint. But yeah, I mean, as more and more of these stories, that are being told, I think we can change that.
Yeah, Karla, I really liked how you describing, your parents' wedding, and I mean, Houston is supposedly the most diverse city in the U.S., I think. And I think we need a multitude of stories, because you can't really like represent what the South is without all these different perspectives, right? And I think I'm super excited to hear that Angela is working on a documentary about Barbara Jordan, because a big part of the identity of whoever holds political power kind of ends up being the identity of these regions and states, right? Like I moved from Austin, Texas, a very liberal leaning part of Texas, in a conservative state to now being in a conservative part of California. And but despite that, whoever holds political power kind of is how we imagine these places. But really, all these different regions and areas, there's diverse viewpoints. And I think we do need to just see a multitude of stories and perspectives to be able to really accurately understand a place.
Tim, I really appreciate you bringing that up, because even when we spoke before, you really made a direct link between political power and sanctuary, the possibility of sanctuary, right, being linked to political power. Does that, do you want to say anything more about that, or does that resonate for you, Karla, you, Naveen?
Yeah, I'll just mention that, as somebody who, moved from Texas to California, I have kids, and just like understanding, like now, like in Texas, you can't talk about race in the classroom anymore, right? Versus in California, ethnic studies is now a requirement for high school graduation. So despite now living in a conservative area where there's still Trump 2020 signs, my kids will get ethnic studies at some point, right? So really political power is so, and the policies that exist do shape our experience.
Karla, I see you nodding.
I was just agreeing. I mean, there's just such a weird disconnect. I mean, it's like living in an alternate reality when you go to Texas, and you're like, you look around and it just, the people in power just, and the laws that are being made just does not reflect, what's happening on the ground and the people who are living in the state. So I was just agreeing with that.
Yeah, no, I mean, when you think about it, because so much of our country's culture and politics and subsequently daily life is driven by narratives, right? And so what you are, in fact, each of us are doing, but you all in a bigger scale, you're creating or working with narrative and examining and exploring. And Karla, you talked about the first film that you made was about somebody else's home, Rust Belt, Ohio, Jonestown. You're a parent now. You're making a film about where you grew up. You have one child? It's one child.
I have two.
Child. Okay.
Two boys.
Sorry. I knew I was gonna but what does that mean in terms of for you personally to make films, or especially be working on a particular film that is really exploring the narrative of your family, but more, and by extension, many other people's communities?
Well, it's really scary because I've never made anything personal before. And, I've done like news pieces, and, working on my first film really is what led me to working on this. I mean, because that was about, yes, as you mentioned, someone else's home. And I was looking at people who lived for generations back in the same town, Youngstown, and we're now fighting to save it. And so, of course, people were asking me, well, why are you making this film? This isn't your town. And then I started thinking about where I grew up, and then I started thinking again about the recordings that I had with my dad. And in making that film, it was directly led me to making this film about my home, which is, and in terms of my kids, it's been like, what am I going to teach them and leave them behind? And my husband is Lebanese and grew up in Nashville. I'm half Filipino, half Indian. And, my kids are very confused about who they are. Like, I'm confused about how I'm going to teach them about their heritage and their culture, and how am I going to root them in a place. So, all of those conversations that are directly feeding into a lot of the themes that are coming out, and then I'm like pulling out of this film. And just like looking at like the role that place has, which doesn't have to be, one place. It can be a story. It can be, we're constantly telling our kids stories about, their grandparents and where they lived. And I think that can also create, a sense of place and history and belonging.
So I know it's one of those things I came to realize, and I hadn't articulated it that way when I initially realized it, but stories are sanctuary, right? They also,
Totally.
help us all determine, and Naveen, we talked a little about this, where I fit in, right? Where, or they explore that question. You're working with that for yourself and for Yusuf. Can you talk a little bit about story as sanctuary and what it means to be making a film in Louisville about?
Yeah, I think even though it's not a film about myself and my journey, I think I feel so connected to Yusuf on some level in terms of figuring out what my identity is. It's like through the process of making this, I'm struggling to figure out what my place is in all this. Like even what Karla is mentioning geographically, like where do I really situate? And I think it's fascinating to talk to like my parents about it, and even with Yusuf to talk to his parents about that, because for them, this idea of like the homeland is so present for them, and it's like a constant struggle for them to like instill this idea of what the homeland is in the kids and us, right? And for us, it's just this distant idea. It's the story, but it's coming back, and it's this idea of like, is this the sanctuary that I've always been seeking? Like, should I go back? Should Yusuf go back? And like, 99% of the time, the answer is no. But I think for me, what's really interesting and what's the power of stories, it's like what's that 1% where you're allowed to like indulge in the what if, and how can that be explored through storytelling? I think that's what we're trying to do with Pinball a little bit.
Thank you. So Tim, how did, as you got deeper into that Vietnamese community in Seadrift, how did you begin to understand their relationship and effect on the culture of that town, and vice versa? What were little things? And I don't mean just the confrontation, but I mean in terms of, when you live in proximity to people, you change them and they change you. And I don't mean necessarily positive or negative, but there is change.
That's what she said. The code for the day to get in.
Oh, we have somebody who needs to probably
The
mute.
floor.
Oh, like that.
Oh, you didn't know? Yeah, there's a new code.
There's a new code, but please mute.
Okay, yeah, in Seadrift, when I started on the project, I had just, read the news articles and did archival research, and I actually didn't know whether the Vietnamese are still in Seadrift, because the shooting incident and the aftermath was pretty traumatic. Once I started on the project, I realized, yes, they are still there, and they're actually the only ones who are still crabbing the waters there. And so as I spoke to more people, just through time, they learned to work with each other and to coexist, right? But I also found out that, this incident that happened, people didn't really talk about it. Like, it happened. And one of the questions I keep getting is like, why are you making this film now? Why, we're good. We're able to coexist now. And so, once the film was made, one of the most kind of impactful screenings for me is when we brought it back to Seadrift. And when community members shared, just like, even though I see this Vietnamese fisherman who runs this bait shop in town every day, I didn't know his personal story, how he got here, what his experience was during, the time of the shooting. So So and we have a white fisherman share, the fact that the Vietnamese learned English better than he learned Vietnamese over time. And part of this conversation is about sanctuary, and it's a little difficult for me to kind of think about the South as a sanctuary for Asian Americans, because you think about the Atlanta spa shootings and Asian hate crimes on the rise in the last few years. But for me, making the film about Seadrift and traveling with the film, you come to realize that there are, second generation, third generation Vietnamese Americans throughout the country now, but actually many of them go back to Seadrift as their home. That's where they have their family reunions. So whatever happened in that community, that is their home now. And it is a safe place that they feel like that, that they return to, right? So for me, that gives me hope, is that a community that has, gone through such a divisive time has somehow learned to be together and coexist.
It's interesting you say that, because there are so many of those stories across many, it's primarily non-white communities across this country, but South as well, whereas people return places because they have paid for it in full for the right to be there, right? The other thing is, though, the United States is a forward-looking country, churns forward, and only the South really has stock and trade culturally in looking back, right? Go to the longtime song, Dixie, I Wish I Was in the Land of Cotton, right? Old times there. But when you think about what you're doing in the films that you're making, you're talking about a present reality and a forecast for what is possible, what a future might be. The future is really just, it's the result of the choices we make today. But I'd love to hear what you think, how you think new stories, new ideas, and widening that aperture, if you will, is or might affect what an evolving South is or could be.
That's a tough question, Noland. I guess, you got me thinking about just how the South is kind of thought about, especially from outside, as a place of racism. And I feel like a lot of times, people from, say, California are thinking of the South as, okay, that's a place that's really racist, and we are not like that. But really, that's not really the truth, right? We all have racism and biases in all communities. But I think, the more we can have nuanced storytelling and be able to see, truly see these different regions for what they are, without really understanding where we are, we can't really chart a better path forward, right? So yeah.
And I think, for my film, I wasn't necessarily thinking about oh, this is a Southern story, except that, in terms of this is where it does take place. But for me, it was more this idea of this is someone who works in a gas station, someone you pass by, everyone has interacted with, at one point in their lives. And who is that guy, and sort of revealing that those stories of those people that you just kind of sort of dismiss in your daily life was one of the main, was a driving sort of impetus for making this film too. So kind of in a larger sense, I feel like all of these stories do that. They're revealing, stories about people that you pass or don't understand, and that can only create like a sense of empathy. And the fact that it takes place in the South is just another, it's just another layer of like of adding these complex, stories about places that we might have just written off as one thing. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Assad Muhammad has a question, and I'll in the chat, and I'm going to read it out because it also gets maybe even asked better than what asked the question I just asked in a better form. He says, I live in Charlotte, North Carolina, and I'm often thinking about ways outside of religious spaces to build more safe and brave spaces for people of color. I wonder what kind of experiences in the South have you witnessed that seem to be effective in bringing folks together and inviting people of different backgrounds to engage with one another? Yeah.
Well,
go ahead.
Just quickly, for me, growing up in Houston, it was often through the arts. I think like arts, I went to a performing and visual art high school that just like brought so many different people together, and sharing in that space, in this artistic space, was definitely a sanctuary. And I think we all kind of could meet each other, through that space.
Yeah, I'd second that as well. And I think that's something that my collaborators and I in Louisville and friends at large are struggling with. And our kind of solution was kind of take it upon ourselves, and we're like trying to create like a micro cinema film center called like Hyphen Film Center that bridges these identities of people who normally don't have safe spaces and can gather around like the art of exhibition, in whatever place that looks like, and like center ourselves around, art making and food and popcorn and and those kinds of things that can be so simple but so necessary.
Karla, when we spoke, you mentioned that downtown Houston in the 90s, 2000s went dead for a period, and that it has built back on the arts and reconfigured itself. Is there anything you want to share around that, or is there a way that art can actually be both social capital does it need to be capital as well?
Well, I think it could be all of the above. Houston has always had kind of a vibrant art scene, although, maybe there was, the museum district and all of that was always, kind of close to the downtown area. And then there was a period of time when it just there was nothing downtown when I was growing up. And that has changed a lot. And now, there are people who are choosing to live down there. And there's things to go to, galleries and art, and it's a whole scene. And I think it's like one of those markers of a place that has like turned around, when you start to see the galleries and the museums, and then it's sort of a signal that like a place is more up and coming, I think. I'm not sure if I answered your question, but I definitely think like the power of the arts to reach, all kinds of people. I mean, that's like one of the reasons why I want to make films is, to reach other people, with these new experiences and meet new people. And so, yeah.
If I may just jump in, just hearing you all talk about art spaces like makes me miss Austin, because Austin has a vibrant like filmmaking community. And I'm now in a smaller city in California Central Valley where it doesn't exist. And so I think we need to build those spaces, and art spaces aren't all safe either for all people. So we need to make sure we build those spaces that are truly inclusive, right? And that's not it's not an easy thing to do, and it's an ongoing process that you have to work at.
Oh, that's real talk, Tim. Really appreciate it. One of the things that is also can you talk about this as well? Because there are a lot of filmmakers who are on this, attending this panel. All of us know, and I think Angela talked about it in the preceding panel. Yes, art is made by individuals, but it is also really made in communities and in cohorts, right? In cooperation, and we feed one another and compete against one another and support one another and learn from one another and teach one another. What resources have you found that help you as an artist who is either working located out of the South or transplanted to the South or doing Southern based work or personal based work in the South?
Well,
know
I
for-
am, oh, no, go ahead, Tim.
I know for me, even though Austin has a filmmaking community that's thriving, ADOC is this online cohort of Asian American filmmakers working in documentary, and getting access to that virtual space just like lets me kind of feel like I'm part of this larger filmmaking community. Because filmmaking can be like a very lonely endeavor at times, despite the long credits list you see at the end of these films. So I really find ADOC, like a community that really is part of how I find support.
And I was just going to say that I'm not in Texas now, but for working on this personal film, which is something I'd never done, I had taken a class on essay filmmaking at Union Docs, and through Union Docs, I met some other filmmakers there, and we were all kind of unhappy with sort of like the artist residencies we were seeing out there, and so we just decided to kind of create our own little group. And it's been amazing. So like we meet, about once a month, and it's just become this place to share, what we're working on, to share resources and advice. So yeah, for me, it was like a matter of just creating it ourselves.
Yeah, no, it's really important to find your people for real.
Yeah,
For
definitely.
real. Naveen, go ahead.
I mean, this is kind of like the marriage of how we found support, especially with pinball. I think the New Orleans Film Society was one of our early supporters with the Southern Producers Lab. My collaborator Brain went through it, and then ITVS's Diversity Development Fund really kind of exploded and expanded the way we thought about making our stories and living in Louisville and living in the South, and how we could kind of be here, but also connect with other organizations around the country. And there was value in what we were doing here. I think, like Tim said, it was like very lonely before that. And both of these organizations really helped us grow and expand.
Sorry. I mean, when we spoke before, you mentioned that there was a shift for you when you began to position yourself and acknowledge that you were by transplants, but Southern artists. And you began to connect around support. And I don't know if that was material support, moral support, knowledge support, whatever. But can you talk a little bit about that in terms of, because again, identity matters in a multiracial, multi-geographic representative republic. I won't say democracy, representative republic.
Yeah, I think the infrastructure was a huge learning curve for us, and having guiding forces along the way is so crucial. I think there's only so much you can do on your own, and if you're not like actively searching for community and finding the resources that are like within your reach. I think Angela kind of mentioned in the previous talk too, of like, what's the next step? And it's kind of like, where are the places that are kind of in front of you that you can take that next step? is where you should start, and that's where we felt like we could start.
Thank you. I'm searching the chat. Do we have any? I'm going to search the chat to see if we have any. There was a couple of questions that were coming through. Hold on, just a second. I zoomed past one. Let's see. Okay, this is from Tulio DeSantis to everyone. Tulio has been a loyal commentator throughout the session. How do you think the duality of having your culture and being an American affect how you all make films?
I mean, for me, I did not go to film school. I did not go to J school. I couldn't afford it. And it was, you know, with my family, it was like you just kind of learn as you go, figure it out. I don't know if that's, you know, that's just speaking to not necessarily like my ethnic background, but just like that's just how I kind of grew up. And so in terms of the filmmaking process, I've actually had to learn not to do everything myself and to, you know, kind of trust people and to build these relationships with other folks. So that's kind of been a big learning curve for me, is not to think that I have to know everything and have all of the answers. And you know, especially with a personal film, it's like I need collaborators to help me, you know, keep me in check, and it's more than ever. So yeah, I mean, in terms of the duality, I'm not quite sure how to answer that part, but I can only speak from just like my personal upbringing. But yeah.
Collaborators are key.
Yeah.
There is a lot of lip service given to collaborative work in this field, and probably more so even in the scripted field. But it is so collaborative in terms of the very best work that gets done. What are the things that you know, what are the lessons and the things that enable you, Tim, to move forward and to grow?
I guess for me, you know, I'm also not sure how to answer that, you know, how my identity helps my filmmaking, but I know like my experience as an immigrant, you know, I do share some similarities with the refugees, the refugee community I was engaging with. But I also realized that, you know, as an immigrant, my experience is so different than refugees. In terms of, you know, the trauma that they had to go through, in terms of how their relationship to America, right? And I know Naveen, you're probably learning that as well through your project. But just, you know, I mean, as filmmakers, we carry all of our background and experiences to how we build relationships with participants. So I don't know if that's a clear answer, but yeah.
Naveen, when I'll just, you know, I remember having a conversation with somebody about your film during the process of open call decision around funding your film, and somebody was saying, really, really kind of anxious and in not saying like, well, I don't know, is it a coming of age story? Is it an immigrant story? What is it, right? And somebody smiled and said, it's all of those things, right? And more, right? Can you know, what is there, and this is not, that's citing Naveen's story, but what lessons can be learned from an idea around expansiveness, fluidity, as we imagine what this country is, what the South is, what our lives are, and where those possibilities are to show or explore that in film, right? And that's a diffuse question, but trying to give you some room to, you know, think about, in a sense, what your center is, or what your you know, what you're aiming for.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, I hope it was you exactly in that voice who said it, all of those things, because I can just imagine that. But I think I'm glad you bring that up, because it is all of those things in terms of, yeah, what is the guiding force, and especially in the type of work that we're interested in doing. I think so often, and that's where, like, the question of like, how do we traverse our duality is kind of interesting, because I feel like it's like a triality, quadrality, like there's all these things that we're like trying to muddle into one thing and make a story, a film, however long it is, and have it addressed all of these things at once. And it's almost like falling into your intuition and letting everything else go. Like there's only so many references you can have, or outlines you can write, or pitch decks you can create, and it's like Miro boards and Google slideshows. And then it's like, well, what feels right and where does it all land is something kind of magical. And it feels like that's like why we love what we do, and not holding yourself so feet to the fire about sticking to the exact things that you set out to do, and only doing what you set out to do. And as everyone said, I think what you mentioned in some of our conversations, like allowing that discovery to happen. And that feels like the strongest guiding force, is just like, if we're constantly discovering relationships and people and moments and angles and shots, and those are the things that kind of add up to, I think, ultimately what we want.
Beautifully said. To that, I will add, once many, many years ago, when I was on hiatus from the sitcom I was working on, and, not up to looking for work again the next day in the newspaper, like back when you used to look for work in the newspaper, I saw that there was a show at UCLA, and I've told the story many times, like an itinerant preacher at this point, but it still holds. It was a show, an exhibit of Romare Bearden paintings, and Romare Bearden was a 20th century painter and collage artist who really chronicled the Black migration experience, among other things. And I went down, and so I said, okay, looking for a job today. I'm going to UCLA. And I went down there, and it was great to see the paintings. It was everything I imagined and more. I'd only seen them in a coffee table book before that. So to see them at scale in my face was great. But the real thing was, there was a little film there. And I think maybe Sam Pollard had been like an assistant editor on that film or something like that. And Bearden is looking out the window, and he says, what you're looking for ain't worth a damn. It's what you find that matters, right? And for all of us, and especially you all as artists, makers, it's what you do with it as well. And so with that, I really want to thank you all for the time you've given me to meet you and get to know you better in advance of this panel. Thank you for coming together and flying blind, and trusting that your stories really speak to one another, and hopefully spoke to this room. We thank everybody who attended, and we thank Zuri for being our guiding light, and for offering South as sanctuary, and for all of us. And I really want to thank you, Tim, for also pushing on that and helping us really explore it to make it real, as Cheryl Lynn would say, to be real. And so that concludes our panel.
Okay. Okay.
Oh no, go ahead. Yeah.
I was going to say, I have a couple more questions if we do. We
Oh,
do
okay.
we do have a little space of time. We have 12:15. So I was like,
okay,
I
I'm
got some
sorry.
questions. It's okay. No, this is a great conversation. Thank you so much, Naveen, Tim, Kathy, right?
Karla,
I'm sorry. Karla, I apologize. I'm just thinking too fast, but thank y'all so much for just sharing your stories and your space. One thing that really resonated with me was this idea that sanctuary is linked to political power, right? Like that was like wow, like that really, really set up a light bulb for me, right? And this idea of like, there is no power without first a sanctuary, right? There's no power structure without first a sanctuary because it provides, safety, whatever. I was wondering just, to talk more about that. How do you feel that the creation of like sanctuary spaces, how does that help undergird or support the political power of migrant workers or migrant people, or folks that are just not politically represented in the South, right? Because a lot of, you're talking about Karla, the redistricting and making it mostly, in Texas, mostly white districts. How are these spaces, these nodes where a lot of folks who are not Black or white come together to build sanctuary? Like, how do these spaces serve as foundation for future political trajectories and power that they can use? I don't know if that was like an abstract question, but more so just like, it's this, I guess, dreaming through that or thinking through that, it just hit me. I was like, wow, that is true, right? Like, I'm thinking the seat of a lot of political power in the Black South is the church, and the church is quite literally a sanctuary, right? So, yeah, I don't know, we can meander on that or think about it, but anyone that wants to answer.
It actually just reminded me of this piece, a news piece that I worked on, which was centered on redistricting in Fort Bend County and specifically in Sugar Land, which has a very high concentration now of Asian Americans. And that area was completely cracked apart. Like, they took Sugar Land, which had the majority, and like literally cracked it into three and then roped in white rural areas to dilute the power there. And in the last election or 2 elections ago, they got sort of within reach of being able to elect someone who is an Indian American Democrat, which if like now that will never ever happen, at least for 10 years. But one of the things it made me think about was there are mosques in that area, and they were able to turn a lot of these mosques into voting centers, because you can vote in churches also, and you can vote in community centers, and they were inviting people from the community to the mosque who weren't, people who weren't Muslim, to welcome them into these spaces as well. And it just kind of, it reminded me of that when you brought up, religious spaces and turning them into more of like a community center. But yeah, it's tough. To create those spaces is the challenge. Is a huge challenge.
Yeah, or to keep those spaces safe, because I think that a lot of times it's very natural for humans to kind of come together around common things, common ideas, common strife. But a lot of times the disruption of sanctuary spaces is the destruction of political power, of agency, of identity as well. Yeah, thank you for sharing.
I think in Louisville, it's been really interesting the past couple of years, because Louisville was a sanctuary city for many years, and obviously that isn't like a legislative designation. It's more like this city has implemented certain policies that are more welcoming. And recently, state legislator has kind of banned this idea of using that identity of calling yourself a sanctuary city. So Louisville can't technically call itself that anymore, which, to your point, is like really interesting in terms of how we accept potential asylum seekers or refugees into a city like Louisville or into the state like Kentucky, where, even though this term doesn't have legislative power, there's like social power and social identity that revolves in the community around being able to claim that and what that actually means, and in people's day-to-day lives, and what you're able to interact with and who you're able to interact with. So I think it's kind of interesting. I think, and Tim mentioned it. It's like, who is the sanctuary for, and how do you like expand that or decide to close it down? It's kind of like unfolding right now in Louisville.
It's really interesting that language is so powerful. The word sanctuary, calling something what it is or what it could be, is kind of like an inception of a movement, or allowing for movement to happen. And removing that name is kind of like stopping it in a way, or attempting to. just the word sanctuary. That's really interesting. Thank you, Naveen, for sharing.
I actually have something that Karla and I were talking about, but it also intersects with your experience too, Naveen, was that
And it also could be the French.
when your families moved to the States, you all were located in the suburbs.
Yeah, because she was facing the wall. That's okay, because and she could turn. I said, I didn't realize you were that mobile.
And the suburbs were new territory. And back then they were surrounded all by farmland. Can you talk about what that, they're not new territory now, but can you talk about what the kind of the blank or the open space of new territory felt like or meant, and what that means now in terms of like, there are fewer and fewer new territories. So how do we reimagine who we are and what we're doing now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's a really great question. I guess it's almost like from the inside out versus the outside in. I think, yeah, Carl, what you mentioned, it's kind of like, yeah, the mosque or the temple is kind of like what our parent generation were building, and that kind of facade and being able to be visible in that sense was so important, like opening up businesses and having your sign that people could see, making sure it's like lit. Those kind of things are like so important. But now it's kind of like it feels like, me personally, like looking inside spaces, and what are the spaces where we can bring people in together, and it doesn't have to be so visible on the outside, because like there's less and less space. It feels like even in my hometown, it's like it's a medical town now. There's all these clinics around, so it's the places inside that feel as a starting point, which is interesting, I guess, to like your point, Zuri, of like camping in the last talk. It's like for some people, it's like going outside. I think for me, it's been kind of like what is inside that is strong for us to start.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm. Thank you for sharing, Naveen. So yeah, I think just some last questions that I have is, a lot of your work is on, or the work that we talked about today, supported by ITVS, is on public television. Are there any other platforms that we can watch your work in full, or places that we can check it out, like Netflix or any other platforms that we can engage in to get to know your work more?
I think I might just for me, Seadrift, go to Tidal8productions.com. You should be able to find links to be able to stream and access it through Canopy, etc.
Title 8 Productions, got you. Naveen, where can we check out Pinball? Is it finished, right? Not finished. Oh, okay, cool. We can't check it out. Not yet. We're jumping the gun. And Karla, where can we check out your work? Even if it's not the film that we're talking about.
My film about my dad is definitely not done, but my first film is you can find it on my website or at whitetownfilm.com. It's streaming on Amazon also. And on my website, you can actually see that piece about redistricting too, if you're interested.
Nice. Thank you. There's no more questions in the chat. And if there's no more questions from Noland, I can just do some parting words and finish out the chat. Again, thank you, Karla. Thank you, Naveen. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Noland, for leading us in this conversation. I truly appreciate your time and this expansive conversation about just Southernness and nuancing it beyond Black and white. We're now going to move into our first music break with vibes provided by Bo McGuire. Thank you, Bo, for the tunes. A lot of people have been just DMing us about this music, so thank you so much, Bo. After the music break at 1:30, we'll be moving into an essay reading, our final essay reading, entitled Human Nature by Colleen Thurston. Filmmaker representing Oklahoma, where she grew up, works, and lives. She'll be sharing with us vignettes and reflections on what she calls the indigenous diaspora. And finally, to close out this year's convening of South Summit, we'll be joined by Stevie Ray Warren, Abraham Felix, and John Sestry Goff at our 3 p.m. session, The Great Remigration, which yours truly will be moderating, and we'll be talking about how to make home where the art is, and in this place that we call the South. So thank you to the speakers. Thank you so much, ITVS, for your support. And thank you for the audience for joining in and your great questions. This concludes our session. I will see you at 1:30, folks.